Students, today we're talking about webs. Food webs. That's right, students. Today's lesson is going to be all about food pyramids, food chains, and food webs. These are also going to be known as diagrams or visual representations of how we transfer energy from one organism to another within the ecosystem. You might remember from our ecosystem definition that when we study ecosystems as biologists, we're really looking at the interactions between different organisms and also interactions between organisms and different abiotic factors, things that are not living. Now, the key to ecosystem study is not just interactions, but it's also going to be how do these interactions work together to create a perfect balance within this world. And balance is key. You've probably already noticed this concept of balance before with the little bit that we talked about in the carbon cycle, where everyone was passing carbon molecules around different parts of the biosphere, lithosphere, and atmosphere. And we're making sure that there's a nice balanced cycle of carbon. As soon as carbon started getting out of balance, getting piled up in the atmosphere, that's when we started to run into the issues like global warming. This week, we're going to talk about something that is also perfectly balanced within healthy ecosystems, and that is energy. The first question that probably comes to mind is, where does all the energy for living things come from? The sun. So, if the sun is the source of all energy on Earth, how do we then take the sun and get that energy to living organisms? What's that? The plants. So let me remind you of these beautiful pages in your notebook where we talked about, that's right, photosynthesis. I took carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, aka source of all energy on Earth, to create usable energy in the form of chemicals, aka glucose. We are now moving on to page 116, and we're going to talk about energy transfers in the ecosystem. The source of all energy is going to be the sun. I'm going to just be kind of drawing diagrams, so it'll be a little bit different from our normal notes. But sometimes visual representation is the best way to go. So the sun is the source of all energy for the biosphere. Most people will say it's the source of all energy. Keep in mind that there are still some bacteria who can do chemosynthesis, where they make their own energy from other organic materials such as nitrogen and sulfur. Pretty cool. Now, the sun is going to supply what we talked about, the plants. And plants are able to take sunlight and make it into glucose. The way the plants do this is through the process of photosynthesis. You're going to put photosynthesis this direction. Now, my plant, because he plays that vital role of converting sunlight into glucose, is going to be called my producer. Because as a producer, he's going to be making all of this unusable light energy, unusable for living organisms, into usable chemical energy, or my beautiful glucose. Now guys, plants have converted the sunlight energy into consumable energy. Who consumes plants? Sometimes us, but not usually us. Those organisms that consume only plants to get that glucose and cellulose from them are going to be herbivores, or our primary consumers. Here we're talking about things like cows or rabbits. Rabbits are good. Rabbits have been a theme for us for online learning, so rabbit it is. Like I said, this is going to be an herbivore. He consumes only plants. And Mr. Herbivore is what I called a primary consumer. Primary meaning he's the first one. He's the first in line to get his energy from the plants. Now, students, who consume garbage? That's right, not me. Things like carnivores, foxes, wolves, coyotes, whoever's out there eating the poor rabbits. But don't feel too bad for the poor rabbits, because it's all part of the cycle of life. These rabbit populations will be controlled by the carnivores who can consume them. I keep saying that word consume because yes, they're ingesting them for their energy. In this case, he's going to be called a secondary consumer. Meaning he is second in line after the plants or producers to get his energy. This chain of consumption could go on with, let's say, an angry bear. I'm so sorry guys, I promise this is a bear. It looks like a cat. Maybe his nose needs to be this way? I don't know. Another carnivore. This time he's going to be considered my tertiary consumer because he's third in line after the producers to get his energy from another organism. And it could continue for a quaternary consumer, an apex predator, all the way up to an apex predator. This simplistic diagram in which I show the transfer of energy from the sun to a producer to a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, and a tertiary consumer, so on and so forth, is called a food chain. It's basically showing the transfer of energy from the sun to producer who makes that energy into glucose, and then each subsequent organism that consumes another organism to get their energy. Now, a food chain that just shows a simplistic transfer of energy from organism to organism is the simplest method for showing energy transfers. We know an ecosystem has way more species than just those 4 I showed you, and is way more complex. So the way that you really show this complexity is through something called a food web. Now, in a food web, you're still going to use chains, but you're going to use multiple chains because there's multiple pathways for organisms to get their energy. You want to start by considering all the species or producers. So that could be any type of plant. Let's say we have some bean plants. Let's say we have some corn plants. Let's say we even have some grass. And finally, another plant that we have in this ecosystem, some clover. I'll then consider some of the primary consumers that I might have in this ecosystem. So yes, we'll still have some rabbits, but we might also consider the fact that we have some birds of some kind. So I'm going to say jackrabbit. A songbird. And let's say we have a field mouse. Oh my gosh, guys, I can't draw a mouse. Mouse with long whiskers. Big ears, right? Mice have big ears, right? And a long tail? It's a field mouse. And once again, like I did previously with my food chain, I want to show the flow of energy from the producers to the herbivores. However, in this case, I might notice that there are multiple pathways of energy. So, jackrabbits eat beans, but field mice also eat beans. Corn is eaten by all 3 herbivores, and you can see already how this is starting to look slightly more complex. Okay. Grass is mostly eaten only by the jackrabbits, let's say. And finally, clover is eaten by the field mice and the jackrabbits. Bring it up a level by adding in a couple different predators here. In my predators, it might look something like this. Once again, I'm going to think about having the flow of energy, right, from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer. So let's think about who might eat the jackrabbit. Jackrabbit is going to give his energy, let's say, to the foxes and potentially the bears. Okay. Songbirds are eaten by badgers and foxes. So once again, I'm showing them giving their energy to these predators. And finally, the field mouse is gladly eaten by all of these. There might be an added level of complexity in that the bear also eats foxes. Now you can see pretty much why this is called a food web, because it's a hot mess with a whole bunch of different food chains showing all the different interactions in terms of energy transfer between producers and consumers. Because your practice asks you to, let's do a little bit of analysis. So we first of all know that these guys are all producers. A producer in a food web is easily identified because there's no arrows going to the producer. Instead, the producer is giving its energy away to all the other organisms in the food web. Remember, their source of energy is the sun, which is not depicted in a food web. A primary consumer is going to be an organism that has only one arrow between it and the producer. So right, it is the first in the chain to get its energy from a producer or a plant. All of these guys would be considered primary consumers, which I'm going to signify by a 1 with a small little circle next to it. Because they only have one single arrow going from a plant to them. I can then follow the chain of command to figure out who my secondary consumer is. That would be 2 arrows away from a plant or producer. So 1 primary, 2 secondary. This gray fox is definitely a secondary consumer. I could do the same thing here. Let's follow another food chain. So the beans feed the mice, primary, which then feeds the black bear. He is also a secondary consumer. Okay. Let's do one more for fun. So clover feeds the mice, who is primary. Mice is going to feed the gray fox. He's secondary. Let's find a badger connection. Corn feeds the songbird. Songbird feeds the badger. 2 arrows. He is secondary. On this food web, you might have noticed that I have actually a tertiary consumer. So corn feeds the jackrabbit, primary. Gray fox, secondary. Gray fox also feeds the black bear. So that's going to mean that black bear can also be identified as a tertiary consumer. And in real life, ecosystems are like this. There are many organisms who are going to serve several different roles, especially as you get into the consumer level. So they might be considered primary and secondary and tertiary consumers, depending on what types of organisms they tend to consume and who they are consumed by. Last thing that you should think about when you're analyzing a food web, and that is what happens when you lose an organism in an ecosystem. Let's, for example, say we were to take out the field mice. And if you want to, you can do this on your notes. If not, you don't have to. All of a sudden, that's going to affect everybody who consumes field mice. So if I take out field mice, black bear is going to lose one of his main food products. So is the gray fox, and so is the badger. This probably means that these guys now have more limited resources. So they are going to be having some competition in their populations, and they would all start to decrease in population size. So loss of this primary consumer results in a decrease in the secondary consumers. But look, the field mouse is not just connected through energy transfers to his consumers, he's also connected to the producers, the things that he consumes. If the field mouse is no longer there to consume the beans, the corn, and the clover, then that means that these populations, bean, corn, and clover, are actually going to increase in size. Because they no longer have a consumer eating them, they're just going to start to grow rampant. There's no one to control their population size, or not as many people to control their population size. It starts to become chaos. Because if you look at it, if the gray fox population goes down and the badger population goes down, the jackrabbit population will go up, and so will potentially the songbird population, or vice versa. They might start over-consuming jackrabbits and songbirds to compensate for field mice consumption. And if they over-consume jackrabbits and songbirds, then that's going to cause these guys' population to spring up like crazy and potentially have too much or too many producers in the ecosystem. Basically, what starts to happen when you're losing even just one single species from your food web is that you start to affect every single other species within the ecosystem. And that is because they're all in a perfect balance of energy transfers from organism to organism. So the increase in population of one organism will result in the decrease in population of another, and vice versa. The delicate balance of the ecosystem is destroyed if you're losing even just one single species. Finally, this also brings us back to the idea of biodiversity, having a whole bunch of variety of species. Because if you can imagine that we had many, many more primary consumers, if we were to lose the field mice, we would actually probably have enough primary consumers that it wouldn't disrupt your ecosystem as much. So in this case, we need to remember that biodiversity is actually going to bring stability to the ecosystem. Because by having a large number of species and of different kinds of species, you're going to become more insulated to changes that could happen. For instance, if the field mice population suffers one season, the ecosystem might be okay if you've got enough other primary consumers to kind of replace or step in for the spot of the field mice in this food web. Having a large number of species is going to keep your overall ecosystem from collapsing if something might happen temporarily to one of the species within it. That's it for this video. It was about food chains and food webs. I broke this whole thing down into two parts, so you can see the second video on food pyramids right here. Remember, students, no matter how tasty they may look, never eat leaves. Okay?